story. This is designed to. I didn't want to do this during class time, but for those of you who have no familiarity with any of these people, I just wanted to give you some images and some pictures to have in the back of your minds while we talk about some of the figures who are important in the history of Corbin's influence in particularly in American poetry. So here's a slideshow. Here's some pictures of these folks. This, by the way, is Corbin at Aranos talking about Kazi Said Komi. No date, but probably figure out it's somewhere in the mid to late 60s. And the first, at least in my reading, which is not that of an expert, but of a amateur, my reading of the reception of Corbin in American poetry in particular divides between Charles Olson and Robert Duncan, because they were both perhaps equally influential in American poetry, but and they were friends, or at least acquaintances, but their aesthetic, their feelings, their approach to life and poetry was quite different, and their response and reaction and appropriation of Corbin were quite different too. It's clear that both of them. This is Charles Olson. I think it's fair to say that neither Olson nor Duncan were transformed by their familiarity with Corbin. And it's probably less true. My guess is that the influence of Corbin on Duncan was perhaps even less than it was on Olson, because when they encountered his work, they were mature and already launched into their respective works. But they both found in Corbin's work something that resonated with their own sensibilities, and because of that, they transmitted their enthusiasm for Corbin to others, and that may have had some importance. This is Charles Olson in Gloucester, an undated picture. Rage of Ocean Without a Shore, Charles Olson and Henri Corbin at the harbor. That's the title and subtitle of a paper that it will remain probably unwritten. But we'll talk about it in the course. This little slideshow is a preparation for my course, How to Read, which we'll be doing shortly. Ralph Maude, who was a scholar, among other things, of Charles Olson, and among many other things, Maude was more than just a scholar of Charles Olson, as it turns out. But in response to Tom Clark's fairly critical biography of Charles Olson, Ralph Maude wrote this, Charles Olson at the Harbor, a biography by Ralph Maude. And as he says right at the beginning, it's more of a reactive biography than a biography. Tom Clark's a biography of Olson, the title of which I forget, seems to me strangely dismissive of Olson. Why would you write a biography of someone whose work and life you scorned? Um, Nonetheless, it has factual information in it, which is interesting. But Maude, who knew and loved Olson and thought he was important, responded to Clark's biography by writing this one. But from our point of view, notice the quote that appears on this cover: "Paradise is a person come into this world. The soul is a magnificent angel." And the rest of this short quote, that's all from Maximus at the Harbor, a poem in the Maximus Poems by Olson. And that whole short quote on the cover here refers completely to Henri Corbin's cyclical time essay. And that's interesting for lots of reasons. So that's why Charles Olson and Henri Corbin at the Harbor, because in Maude's telling, even though Maude found Olson's appropriations of Corbin difficult to follow, as he said, he nonetheless puts what may be the most important nodal point of the meeting between Olson and Corbin on the cover of his biography of Olson. So that says something about the importance of Corbin's vision for Charles Olson. If you don't know anything about Olson, you need to know that his major poetic accomplishment is the Maximus poems, which remained unfinished at his death in 1970. The Maximus poems have as their central geographical location Gloucester, Massachusetts, in the same way that Blake centered Jerusalem on London in Golgonooza. Gloucester is the location for Olson's visionary geographies. And there's much, well, the Maximus poems can't be read without understanding that. Because the Maximus poems range throughout history, geologic history and human history. And Olson lived in Gloucester. He was born in Worcester, but he moved to Gloucester and he centered his Maximus poems, which are both factual and historical and contemporary and ancient and geological and mythological, in a way that comports with, to a certain extent, and we could talk about that in the class, with Corbin's notion of a visionary geography. He didn't finish them. There were lots of fragments of the final part, or what became the final part. Had he lived longer, there might have been many more Maximus poems. They were put together, the last volume, by his students and followers. Also, this is a spectacular picture of Diane de Prima and Charles Olson. And Olson was a very large person physically. I think he was 6'7" or 6'8". And so Duprima, not a tiny person, um, yeah. Olson's relationship to women is contentious. He's in my experience of reading him extraordinarily masculine in both a positive and negative sense, and you will find people critiquing him very strongly for patriarchal bias, and at the same time you'll find women poets, particularly I'm thinking of Anne Waldman, who said, "Well, yeah, well, he was, but he also was just crucial for her understanding of what it meant to be a poet." Um, and so, as is true of many uh, important figures in culture, it's a mixed it's a mixed legacy. Um, Here's Robert Duncan, Charles Olson, and I forget the name of the woman. They were on the campus of UC Irvine or Berkeley, or someone in my audience will know where that is, but it gives you a good idea of Olson's stature. Here he is at Black Mountain College. He was for a time the rector at Black Mountain College, which is kind of astonishing because, as could be said of Newt Gingrich, Charles Olson should never have been allowed to run anything. Black Mountain College was on its way out in any case, but he didn't help in any. This is a picture, as I think, from the infamous Berkeley Poetry Conference in 1965, where he infamously spoke for an extremely long time, extemporaneously read some poems, and got pretty drunk. This was either a moment of extreme embarrassment and shame for some of his followers, and others felt otherwise about his completely uncontrolled um, performance that evening. This is where some people felt that he was simply being a buffoon. Others felt that he was being um, profoundly uh, open and vulnerable and creative. And there's recording and transcription of his speech that night, and so each of us can make our own conclusions. that is Olson reading in 1965 from Corbin, Avicenna and the Visionary Recital. Not, I think, at the Berkeley Poetry Conference, but in the same in the same time period. We can talk about Olson's interpretation of Corbin later. This is this is Charles Olson's bottle of scotch left on the lectern after his talk at the Berkeley Poetry Conference, July 23rd, 1965, Wheeler Auditorium, UC Berkeley. Ed Sanders. Ed Sanders, boy, I think he's still alive. He was a founding member of the Fugs. For those of you who are alive in the early 60s, you will recognize the name. So Olson is one particular kind of personality who was drawn to the work of Corbin for a variety of reasons, and we'll talk about that. Robert Duncan, equally passionate and idiosyncratic, but a very, very different kind of person. They knew each other, and they were friends in a way. And each of them a powerful force in American poetry in the middle part of the 20th century. Duncan's relationship to Corbin is it feels to me different because Duncan is naturally Corbinian in a way that Olson is perhaps not. For Olson, the reading of Corbin was energizing and spectacular and full of sparks and flames. For Duncan, it was I know this. This is my material. For Duncan, he's naturally an occupant of Corbin's imaginal realm, without any bells and whistles and sparks. It's a little hard to articulate what I'm trying to say. So that whereas Olson may have gotten great energy and enthusiasm and confirmation from Corbin, I think Duncan would not have. He would have merely recognized he would have merely have recognized someone with whom he shared fundamental presuppositions, and that would have been all there was to it. One of the primary documents to read is the HD book, which throughout expresses sentiments that are in line with much of Corbin. Here's Duncan and Olson. Where this was taken, I don't know, but it must have been California somewhere. Ken Irby, Robert Duncan, and Anne Waldman, 1972. Irby and Waldman. Irby also, I am told, read Corbin with some attention. Whether Waldman did or not, I don't know. Although I did discover that she mentions him in a footnote to one of her fairly recent books, something she did in the last decade or so. So she's perfectly familiar with him. Well, what struck me is in a letter from an email note that I got from yeah, Diane DePrima several years ago. She said in an email that, well, we were all reading the Bollingen books, you know. Anything that came out from Bollingen was widely read by people in the poetry community throughout the country. And of course, Corbin's book, The Avicenna Book, and Creative Imagination, and then later Spiritual Body and Celestial Earth, all came out in Bollingen, Princeton Bollingen. And so they were read by many people. This is Duncan and Waldman and an unidentified person and Trunkpa. And then also of some importance, Eric Mottram, who was a British critic and a poet, wrote an essay in '94 that I didn't discover until I was fairly late in my attempt to figure out who knew about Corbin. He wrote an essay in '94, Tahil and Henri Corbin, in which he misspells Corbin's name because Corbin did spell it Henri with a Y. A legacy for radical American poets, which is a milestone, a really important piece to read. To understand the place that Corbin occupied for radical American poets in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on. And we'll talk about that in the class. And then just so that you have some pictures of these people, this is Robert Kelly, a relatively recent picture of an elderly Robert Kelly, who is the central figure in Tahwil, or How to Read, which was published in '74, I think, which was a conversation and a poetic event with Kelly and Quasha and Stein. This is George Quasha, who I've never met, but is a genuinely nice person in his online persona, and has been very helpful to me over the years in helping me to figure out where Corbin stood in this cultural milieu, as it were. A heck of a nice guy. And a poet and an artist and a musician and an essayist, and I would say a philosopher. He's a brilliant guy. He has a wonderful website. He's very generous with all of his writings and whatnot. And so I suggest if you just look up George Quasha, you'll find his website. Here's some thoughts that I've gleaned from George Quasha's essay on Robert Kelly's poem book, Uncertainties, which attempts to show the importance of Corbin's notion of tahwil, or spiritual hermeneutics, or visionary recital for radical American poetry, as Mottram said. We'll just read these points now, and we'll discuss them in the class. the idea of the visionary recital, of a poem as a visionary recital, suggests that the text itself is a continuous and present, that you must engage as your own. Each reading is a first time. Those of you who are familiar with Lectio Divina, or with Luther's notion of how to read the Bible, will find echoes here. The meaning is uncertain. No paraphrase is possible. The reading is the alchemical operation. This reading cannot map onto any procedure. It cannot be known in advance. And the message of the text is the state of receptivity necessary to read it. The tahwil, the visionary recital, builds an altar, not a temple. As is true of all these phrases, that requires a tremendous amount of unpacking. The process is proprioceptive. Proprioception is a term that Olson gave a lot of weight to, and it concerns the bodily nature of understanding. Visionary recital requires an open identity because we are the fundamentalists of our own ideas, and the visionary recital helps us to let go of our fundamentalism because it is a process that can save us from ourselves, because it teaches emptiness. And in the end, if we're lucky, all our secret personal fundamentalisms dissolve into breath.